without any further ado, Whit and Svan, can you tell us about the Gylfaginning, where it comes from, what it is, and feel free to go ahead and start off with what you want our folks to know about it this evening.
So the Gylfaginning or Gylfaginning, or I mean the translation of it is hard for a lot of folks as far as exactly how it's kind of placed together. I always say the Gylfaginning, the tricking of King Galfi, the delusion of King Galfi, or the kind of illusion of the mind, if you will, is really Snorri Sturluson's setting up of more or less a handbook or a manual for skalds to utilize as a backdrop, a format in order for them to continue on the tradition of poetry. There are many different styles of poetry that were utilized, and I think that this represents the corpus of lore as a story to be transformed into poetic format. I think that was his first and foremost intention. I believe that Snorri Sturluson was an Icelandic nationalist, especially given the time of politics with Denmark and with Norway. And one of the key factors, I think, in his drive, almost in a sense of formulating national pride, was to keep the poetic formulations alive and to keep them going. And this coming quite a long time after the conversion of Iceland in the year 1000. By 1220, Snorri Sturluson and Saxo Grammaticus were starting to really formulate their lore and build it together. And it wasn't found till a lot later and actually, disseminated. But it was more or less, I think, its intention was set early on. And that's why, like, during the Gylfaginning, when you see a lot of things, he references other skalds, and he pulls from the Poetic Eddas and shows that he mentions certain skalds utilizing things in references to the shields of Valhall, or just in the turnings of certain verses. He'll say, such did Bragi the Wise, or actually, let me see. I have one of their names right here. Let me see.
So while Svan's looking, some of you might not know, as far as Svan's street cred, Svan is by birth an Icelander. So he's sharing some of the nation of his birth's heritage and poetic tradition with us tonight. I always default to Svan on pronunciation and things of that nature.
Yeah, it says, like, thus says Bragi, the ancient skald, that Gevion drew from Gylfi, gladly the waves drove freehold. So he's referencing how they would utilize it poetically. And when you get translations, there are a lot of different translations, but the idea of transferring meaning and also holding to alliterative format is the big, I would say, the biggest hurdle that a lot of translators try to do. They don't want to lose the meaning, but they want to try to maintain the poetic format. Predominantly being in fornidhuslaug, the old style of alliterative rhyming in Icelandic. Yes, I was, for a lot of people that might not know, I was born in Iceland. I was born in Reykjavik. I grew up speaking Icelandic until I was about 6 years old, and then I moved to the United States. So that's why I don't have an accent. I was the baby of the family, and came here. And my father is American, but he worked for NATO and spoke the language. And for the longest time growing up, I remember thinking that he was a police officer when he was in uniform. He worked with NATO up there and was sub hunter. So he was looking for Russian submarines and was working with them. So as far as my linguistics go conversationally, I would not be so filled with hubris to proclaim I have conversational, but pronunciation and reading it, and also being able to look through translations and kind of get an idea based off of other words what they may mean is the huge, I think, strength that me and you kind of often pass around, is the idea of what could these things mean. There's a perfect example is like with emir, or a lot of Americans call it Yimmer. The emir goes by another name, Aurjelmer. Aurjelmer, the G is not a hard G, and Yelmer means to scream or to roar or to primordial sound. And Aur is often translated to being like clay, but I think it means shaping. And so because it denotes to what you can do with clay, not necessarily clay itself. So the primordial shaping sound would be, I think, a more spiritual translation as opposed to maybe a literal one or a poetic one. So that's where I think for a lot of people to understand my reasonings behind it is because it's coming from a spiritual point of view as opposed to trying to keep the poetic or even the linguistic truth to it. And again, these are my interpretations, but interpretations are based every publishing company and scholar, and I am not by any means like a schooled scholar. I've just been a believer since the early 90s and have long since just poured over a lot of the writings to try to make a better understanding from a spiritual perspective. So
Svan may not be a lettered scholar in these subjects, but he is a practicing priest of the Aesir. He sits on the Witten of the Church of the Aesir in Midgard, certainly the largest and most successful real Asatru organization there is. I think Svan's expertise is self-evident when you hear him talk, but certainly he is absolutely an expert in the field. The other thing I'd like to say at this juncture, and Svan brought it up, word meaning is so very important. When you look at names, if they're in a foreign language, they may sound cool or different, but names mean things. And I think that sometimes, with the exception of a few of them in English, we've lost that connection between the name and its meaning. That's extremely important in our lore. The gods didn't come to us and introduce themselves by name. The name was assigned to them by worshipers based on perception of the deity. It's very important to understand the names for the high gods, for their accoutrements and, things associated with them, but also for, the lesser characters in our myth cycle. But etymology and understanding names adds such a depth to our lore. I know a lot of you are already there and already do it, but for some of the new folks, maybe take the time to, go down those rabbit holes of etymology as you read our lore. And I think that your understanding will be much richer because of it.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the comments on the side here. Tracy Adler brings up, the Gylfaginning. The F in the middle of the word is usually a V sound. Gylva is, of course, King Gylfi, and his ginning, his tricking of himself. And he goes by the name Gangliri. Gong is the same as like in Wolfgang. It means to walk or to go, to travel the path, to take the stride. And his name Leary, kind of synonymous with like the word leery, like a cautious, but in the Nordic sense, it means tired or kind of refusing to go further. And so it's a tongue-in-cheek name that he presents to the Aesir. He says, I'm travel weary. I'm over walking, basically. It's kind of the joke behind it. My feet are tired. My dogs are barking. I'm done. So I'm here and I want to ask questions.
So Svan, why do we care? Why is the Gylfaginning of importance to us?
Well, there's in overall, I mean, this is I find a great point in which we have to remember that the poetics, the stories that we normally talk about in story form, come from poem. And in the tricking of King Galfi, we see more of a story format being supported by poetics, and I think that's really important. I have dabbled around with poetry throughout my time and trying to, in prayer and things like that, but I'm a storyteller at heart, and I think this is really important for us to remember that the poetics are being formulated from stories that were spoken, and that the elevation of a poet was high. Somebody, that had a lot of land, a lot of money. They could afford to have a poet in their hall, memorizing these things and speaking to the folk, and it was a treat, much like a musician. And to hear these poems was beautiful, almost sing-songy, and had a lot of comedy and entertainment. And so I think it's really important for us, firstly, to know that it come from stories. But when we talk about religiously, there is a crossroads where this really happens to us understanding the time and climate in which Snorri was in, and the kind of the material of the situation. A lot of things that are confusing to people are the reasonings, which are unexplained and often speculated, about his euhemerism, the idea that he's writing the gods as humans, and he does it as in good faith. He does it in the premise that he is not trying to usurp the power of the church. He's trying to keep the poetic form alive for Icelanders. And so it's generally accepted that Snorri was doing this in order to lessen the kind of the fervor that it would create in the people of Iceland. So on the material level, we can kind of see that, and it throws a lot of people off to the idea that they were humans. But Saxo Grammaticus did this before Snorri, and he did it not in good faith, being that he was a devout Christian. So he kind of showed the gods as extremely mortal, extremely filled with avarice, and oftentimes switching roles, in which the gods of goodness were seen as kind of antagonistic or driven by mortal and earthly desires. So even though Saxo does place some very interesting, I think, nuggets of lore and interesting things to ponder about, it's more so Snorri is better to look at, to building or unraveling the spiritual nature of the writing. And when we talk about it from the church aspect, I mean, obviously a lot of people don't know certain things have already kind of been implemented. The understanding of the 12 Aesir and of the 12 Aus, the male, the gods, or the masculine, and then the 12 Ausinjur, the feminine, is brought up during this time in which Gangleri asks. And it is said that, the tripartite that he encounters explains to him that these are the gods that we pray to. That there are other divine beings that are encapsulating in heaven, and there are not necessarily divine beings, but powerful primordial beings that we are all interacting with. But these are the 12 that you should pray to. So a lot of times when people see the sun and rod that's in a lot of the murals that I've been painting, the symbol of the 12-spoke wheel has become synonymous with the 12 Aus and the 12 Ausenjer. It's the completion of the solar aspect, the idea of divinity in and of itself, the idea of being the moving power around the Axis Mundi, or around the Aus himself in the temple. So a lot of that, the aspects of the 12 became a huge part of the church. I think one of the most notable things was the reconstruction of the holy tides. For the longest time, everyone was kind of doing different things. And as 12 became more of a prevalency in understanding and creating a foundation back towards everything that's being spoken of in the Gylfaginning, we start to reiterate that through things. So what ended up becoming of the holy tides, making sure that we had 12. 12 was, again, another reiterated number of, structure, order amongst chaos. And so taking from, I guess, the generally accepted 8 and saying, no, we are going to do 1 a month, and it's going to cover the spans of the year, and we'll have 12. And so I think that's huge significance as of recently. I think if anybody who's been around long and has seen this maybe wondered why this transition happened. We've had questions on before about why Sigurblot and Ostera and all of these things were moved around. And that was the reasoning, was to attain the order of 12, not necessarily to fill in the gaps, but to see that the structure is solid in 12. How do we get there? What is the best way to achieve that order? And that's, I think, one of the biggest things that's kind of come out of this reading of, as far as substantiating it within the church.
Nick asks, getting us back to tonight's theme. So the order of our Hofs is from the Gylfaginning. Why, yes, it is, Nick. Yes, it is. I'm glad that you said that, because it's something that I wanted to mention. It's one of the reasons, I say it's the reason that we're doing this show on this topic tonight. So one of the early conversations I remember having when I first got involved in Asatru in 2001, 2002, was with a gentleman up in Alaska, and again, that's 2001 or 2002, and Asatru has been going since, in its modern incarnation, since 68. So 40 years in, I don't know, 34 years in or whatever. Anyways, he was asking, and we were kind of pondering, like, what is it? What gods do we believe in? Which gods do we worship? And these really fundamental questions stayed very nebulous. Because our source material is spread throughout the continent, throughout the British Isles, throughout Scandinavia, and over the course of 1,000, 1,500 years, it makes it a daunting task to exhaustively figure out which gods exist, which gods, who do we call on, who's this, who's that. There's all these endless questions, and it was time to come up with some answers. So around 2014, a mentor of mine at the time, a gentleman named Brad Taylor Hicks, who was the second in charge of the AFA at the time, he and I were together, and we were contemplating this question, and like, okay, so let's break it down to where we simplify. And one of the beautiful things about the Gylfaginning, as opposed to it being a way to teach poetry, like so much of the rest of the Edda is in that way, the Gylfaginning specifically is a way to give background, is a way to set up the cosmology of Asatru in a coherent way that made sense to somebody who was seemingly unfamiliar. You know, all the way from the creation story through explaining our gods, explaining our goddesses, explaining the worlds, and really drawing that out in a clear way. And so that clarity is really important so that we stay focused on what we do. And we decided at that point that that's the order we were that those 12 are the 12 gods that it's beneficial for us to worship. So we're going to start there. And that's what we're going to do. And at this time, this is before we had Odin's Hofs. We had no Hofs at that point. But those are the 12 gods we're going to focus our worship on. And at that point, we were resolved together, and I was resolved internally to start rebuilding that bridge between us and our gods in terms of our worship, in terms of our temples, in terms of how this was going to go. And, I didn't know I was going to be the one making those calls at that point, but that was going to be a focus of what I was doing. Early on at Odenshof, before it was Odenshof, it was initially called the New Grange Hall. And we ran into a copyright issue with the Grangers who had owned the hall before us. And this was a decision made before I was calling the shots. But very shortly after I took over, we had to rename the Hof. And it was essential and crystal clear to me at that moment that we needed to dedicate that Hof to Odin. And that we were going to, from there on, however long it was going to take us, at this point it had taken since 68 to 2015 to get our first Hof. So in the decades to come, when we finally get a second Hof, we're going to order them in this Gylfaginning order. But by reestablishing that bridge, I think that has led to many, many blessings for us and an acceleration on all these things. 5 years later, within 5 years, we got our second 2 Hofs, and we stayed faithful to that naming scheme. We just 2 years after that initial 7 years from our first Hof, we now have our 4th Hof. And we're continuing in that process. But yeah, that's why I wanted us to talk about the significance of this poem tonight. And I'm glad that you asked that question. Cody asks, Fawn, would you say the Gylfaginning was a precursor to you picking up your storytelling style?
Yes and no. I wish I could say yes or no. But there's so much of the lore in the Gylfaginning that you can't. I mean, this is the deep root of what we had. I think this is where Odin encapsulated the mysteries of a lot of things, wrapped in a lot of more of the material, and an understanding that Snorri was going to portray the gods as mortals, but in this portrayal, as we go, we see so much of these secrets and the divines, and there are little things that I would in my storytelling style kind of look into, try to unravel some of those secrets. So I think the corpus of the lore is deep and numerous, but there are little things that are worth noting that I in my stories I try to preface. Different things from the formulation of Audhumla being from the proto-matter of the universe in Niflheim, to everything from the tripartite that's being presented before Gangleri, in which he does see the High One, and he sees even high, which even meaning leveled with the same height as the High One, and the third or three. And so the tripartite concept, I think, is being presented there pretty clearly, even though maybe even Snorri wasn't necessarily trying to present it as a kernel of knowledge that connects us to other Aryan branches of our faith. So my storytelling, I think, takes a little bit more leeway into trying to reveal little hints that help spurn thought as to why things might be presented in a certain way. Why there might be 2 horses as vehicles for the sun and 2 horses as vehicles for the earth, but only 1 vehicle for the moon. And out of those 3 celestial bodies, the moon is the only one that doesn't have its own axis. It doesn't have its own rotational. So that, I think, is a kernel of deeper truth that isn't necessarily placed out there. And sometimes in my storytelling, I'll try to leak those things in as just a proponent of thought, that our ancestors and their knowledge may very well have been, or the fact that the gods gave this knowledge to us, even if King Galfi is seen as a real man, or as seen as a king of men. The idea that the nobility learning power from the gods and then transferring it to the people, I think is important. I think that's so I will oftentimes try to pepper those little things into my storytelling.
Rowdy Dude asks, is the topic piece of literature a standalone piece or a part of a bigger collection? Svan, break it down for us.
No, so the Gylfaginning is part of, I would say, 3 pieces. The Skald, or basically the rules of the Skalds and the way that it can be spoken about, or the rules of poetry. And last is the list of kennings, a kind of a corpus of lore for the Skalds to use. And it's very, very interesting because they kind of allude to either common things, war things, or divine things. The idea of the multiple namings of Ymir are kind of listed there as well, in which, the idea that like Brimnir, the brimming one, or Blaunir, the blue, and Alljelmer, the shaping screamer, are all part of that. So there's a lot of cool poetic things, I think, that are worth looking into, and oftentimes it's glossed because there's only a few stories in the Gylfaginning that has things. But for instance, like one that most everybody knows is Thor's, it's often referred to as Thor's trip to Jotunheim, or Thor's travel to Jotunheim. That's placed within the Gylfaginning. So there's a lot of stuff there, but it does have, as it goes into the latter half, or the latter 2/3, it's more driven towards poetics, but there's a lot of mysteries to be gleaned in some of the kennings there. So yes, it is not just only, there's 3 pieces.
All right. Since the Gylfaginning speaks on Ragnarok, how is that displayed in reality? Microcosm, macrocosm? Is it the future, past, present, all 3? Yes. Spawn, take it away.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Yes. No, the beauty of, and I think the power of Odin in his correlation to folding and weaving this seed that would surpass into this through the dark ages and through the times where the expression of the folk to their gods was going to be greatly tested. The beauty of it is that the application of meta or mythic language, it applies in all levels of timing. So some people could speculate in different schools of trying to understand Germanic mythology. They have placed, of course, euhemerism and the idea that they're humans, or that there's a vegetative cycle to them, and there's some sort of a premise around nature. Or sometimes they go based on Aryan tribal structure and government. That's like Dumazil and his structuralism. But overall, when you read them, yes, it applies the timelessness of it. I've heard a perfect example would be, and again, I'll address Ragnarok, but the binding of Fenris, or Fenrirwolf, in his binding, some people have argued perhaps this is some sort of mythological connection to the Germanic people making certain agreeances with Rome, and obviously the wolf in connection to the founding of Rome. That's the beauty of the language and the stories of the gods, is that they are timeless and they interlap with everything in the moment and in the past and thus into the future. So we can project the understanding of Ragnarok and seeing Balder both as presiding as the heart of the folk soul, the heart of the gods, seeing the death and the value of the outsider guiding the hand of the blind brother against the heart of the folk and the gods, and him descending and then him rising again as being all of those. And so I think it's a disservice for us to strictly think of things in a logical or linear pathway, but to see them as more of a coiled spring that's compressed all into one moment.
So, and this has taken a long time to make sense to me as well. So if it's a strange concept, I understand that. The mythic takes place in mythic time, and mythic time is very different than historical time, than linear time. It doesn't make it any less truthful, but so many things are simultaneous in a mythic sense. The story and the value of those cycles play out in millions of microcosms and millions of macrocosms. You find those cycles in your own life. You find them in the life of your community. You find them in the life of races and the life of nations. Perhaps you find them in the life of galaxies. As it is, one of the things that I think is most beautiful when I think about this period in the Asatru Folk Assembly, I think about this in terms of when the waters recede and the gods come back after Ragnarok, and they set the table up right, and they replace the pieces, and they reset up what was once holy. We're reforging that bridge. We're reforging that golden age, and we're a part of it right here and right now. Sigurheim, that I just talked about, is such a huge plank in that. We are currently on, Ithavol, restructuring that holy center, that place for our folk. And it's really special to be a part of that. In the meantime, I'd like to cover a little bit more about the Gylfaginning as a source. As Nick mentioned earlier, it is the source that we get our ordering of our temples, at least to start out, and kind of a definitive measure of which of our gods are the gods beneficial for mankind to worship. And it's a really well presented and concise way of understanding our cosmology in an informative way, and not just in an artistic way. Svan, do you have any more you want to add on the Gylfaginning, its importance, its place in our corpus of lore, or why it's particularly significant for us to give credence to?
I think it's worth noting first and foremost that what is spoken of and then what is brought into verse is very important and should be noted by the reader, that we're gaining extra access when we talk about knowledge that's cross all the stories, when we're looking at them from whether it's the Gylfaginning, whether it's Fathrudismal, whether it's Grimnismal, whether it's the Alvismal, in which Thor even talks to Alvis about correlations and kennings and things. These across the board can be used to compare and to kind of glean deeper wisdom of the way our ancestors saw the divine, saw the divinities in a poetic format, and thus glean some of the ideas of their power. Another major thing too is bringing it back to the 12 temples of the gods. So it's worth noting, of course, in the Gylfaginning that Freya is mentioned in the list, and also Hodur, or Hod, Balder's brother. And of course, lastly, the kinslayer Lopter is mentioned. So it's worth noting first and foremost when we come into that, Njordr, let me back it up. Odin, his sons are mentioned first, and that's of course Thor and Balder. And then when we talk about Njordr, Frey is mentioned and Freya is mentioned. However, we've decided to go first with the Aus and to take the formulation of the Aus first. And so when you look at the list, you see this ordering and you're like, oh, well, how it's kind of changed. But it's not necessarily changed. It's that when we the concept of the Ausinir and how they will be placed in devotionals and in the premise of Hoffs or buildings or harrows or groves or whatever it may formulate into, the point was to find the way now. And so Freyr is mentioned. Yes, Freya is mentioned, but she will be that will be negotiated when we tackle the Ausinir. So I've always been of the mind to state that we have the 12 Aus that are mentioned in the Gylfaginning, and in which the three say there are 12 Aus or gods and 12 Ausinir. But in the list, they of course mention Freya because of her correlation to Njordr. The other point is it's well worth noting and stating that Hod is not worshipped by men, and it is stated as such. And again, in our faith, looking at Balder and Hod as both diametric polarities, they source from the same. They are, but one is bright and one is dark. One is awareness and one is ignorance. One is governance and the other is even possibly the point of destruction, and the idea of either whether it's internal or external destruction. So Hod is seen as a polaric force to Balder, and so Balder is, of course, order and light. So the temple to Balder was focused upon, and because Hod is mentioned as not being prayed to by men, but merely understood as the point of his Orlaw. And lastly, of course, Lopter and our total rejection of the kinslayer, the total rejection of the outsider, the one who kills his blood brother's son. That would be obvious, and I think that we don't really need to go into that, but it is worth noting that the Asatru Folk Assembly has that stance against that kind of desire or need to aggrandize aberrations that seem to be pervading in modern times. They aggrandize the aberrant. When our ancestors saw the aberrance of Lopter, they knew that yes, these things are oftentimes that which is vile remains because it seems to give credence to its existence, and even aids in the folk. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned in that. And I think that's why the gods have the story for us to clearly see. But eventually that aberration turns into malevolence and malignant form. So obviously we take a strong stance against that. That is chaos and the warning of allowing chaos to come in, both in Fenris Wolf and also into by Lopter Laufison. So